I am 77 now, but I still remember the morning of my 67th birthday as if it happened yesterday. My name is Richard Miller, born and raised in Chicago. A man who worked his whole life, built his own small business, and thought he raised his children with love, discipline, and honesty. Life had never been easy for me. I grew up poor, the son of a factory worker and a school cleaner. My father used to come home with tired eyes and oil stains on his clothes. My mother always smelled of chalk and cleaning liquid. But they taught me something no school could ever teach: how to stand tall when the world tries to break you. I spent 40 years of my life running a construction company. I built houses for strangers, roads for the city, and schools for children I would never meet. I worked in the hot sun and in the freezing snow, my hands full of cuts, my back aching every night. But I was proud of my life. I never asked anyone for money. I never begged, and I always believed that my own children would be my true reward in old age. I had one daughter, Emily. She was my pride when she was little. I still remember the day I bought her a small red bicycle. She was only 8, but she rode it as if she was flying. She used to hug me tight every evening when I returned home, my shirt dirty with cement dust, my hands rough from work. "Daddy, you're my hero," she would say, and I believed her. But years change people. Somewhere along the way, Emily grew distant. She went to college, married a man named Stephen, and slowly stopped calling me Daddy. She called me Dad, then sometimes Richard. Her husband was a smooth talker, the kind of man who wore expensive suits but never had a real job. I could smell trouble from the beginning, but Emily was stubborn. "He loves me, Dad," she told me once, "and that's all that matters." I stayed silent. I didn't want to lose her. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a cold December morning. Snow was falling outside, and I had just made myself a cup of black coffee when Emily called me. "Dad," she said, her voice sweet, almost too sweet, "can you come over for breakfast? Stephen and I have a surprise for you." I thought maybe she wanted to celebrate my birthday a few days early. My heart softened. I wore my old grey coat, put on my scarf, and drove to their house. When I entered their dining room, everything looked so normal. The table was full of food: pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, even fresh orange juice. Emily smiled at me, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "Sit down, Dad. We have something important to tell you." Stephen was sitting across from me, his face calm but his eyes sharp like a knife. I sat, feeling a strange heaviness in the air. Then Emily placed an envelope in front of me. "Dad," she whispered, "this is your surprise." I opened it. Inside was a thick set of papers. I scanned them quickly and my heart froze. It was a document showing Stephen's debt, over $400,000. I looked up, shocked. "What is this?" I asked. Stephen leaned forward, his voice was cold. "It must be paid by Monday. You're the only one who can help us." I felt blood rush to my head. "Are you insane?" I shouted. "Why would I pay your debt? That's not my responsibility." Emily's smile disappeared. Her face turned hard. "Dad," she said, "if you love me, you'll do this for me. Please. You have money saved. You can pay." I shook my head. "No, Emily, I worked my whole life for that money. That is my retirement, my sweat, my blood. I will not give it away to cover his mistakes." The room turned silent for a moment. Then Emily's face twisted with anger. She grabbed her cup of hot coffee and threw it at me. The burning liquid splashed across my chest. My shirt was soaked and the pain made me gasp. "Get out!" she screamed. Stephen stood and pointed at the door. "Old man, leave. You're useless to us if you won't help. Get out before I make you." My heart broke in that moment. I looked at my daughter, the little girl who once called me her hero, now standing there with hatred in her eyes. I slowly stood up, my clothes wet with coffee, and walked toward the door. My hands trembled, not from the burn, but from the betrayal. As I stepped outside into the snow, I whispered to myself, "I raised a daughter who no longer sees me as her father. She sees me as a bank." An hour later, my life turned even darker. I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing there. One of them said, "Richard Miller, you are accused of assault. You need to come with us." I was stunned. "Assault? What are you talking about?" The officer showed me a report. Emily had filed a complaint that I attacked her and Stephen during breakfast. My knees went weak. I couldn't breathe. My own daughter had called the police on me. The police officer's hand was firm on my arm as if I were some dangerous criminal. At 67, my bones ached from old injuries. My back was weak, but still, they put cold steel handcuffs on my wrists. I looked at them in disbelief. "Officer," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I am her father. I raised her. I never touched her with anger in my life. She's lying." The younger policeman shook his head. "Sir, we just follow the report. You can explain at the station." I sat in the back of the police car, staring out at the snow-covered streets. My mind was full of memories, Emily's childhood laughter, her school plays, the nights I stayed awake working overtime just to buy her books and clothes. And now she had thrown coffee on me, called me useless, and accused me of violence. When we reached the police station, they booked me, took my fingerprints, and locked me in a small cell. I sat there for hours, listening to the sound of other men shouting, the clanging of doors, the cold silence of betrayal. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept asking myself the same question. How did my little girl turn into this? The next morning they let me call someone. I had no one left to call. My wife had passed away 10 years earlier. My brothers were gone. My only child was the one who had put me here. Finally I called my lawyer, an old friend named Peter. He arrived quickly. When he saw me, his face was full of shock. "Richard, what happened? Why would Emily do this?" I told him everything. The envelope, the debt, the coffee, the shouting. He shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "She wants your retirement money, Richard. She's trying to trap you. If the court believes her, you could lose more than your savings. You could lose your freedom." My heart sank deeper. Peter worked hard. He spoke to the officers, showed them my clean record, reminded them of my age, my health. After hours of waiting, they released me on bail. I walked out into the cold night air, a free man but with chains around my heart. When I returned home, I sat alone in my living room. The house felt empty, too quiet. My wife's photo sat on the shelf, her gentle eyes staring at me. I spoke to her picture like I used to when grief was too heavy. "Margaret," I whispered, "our daughter has turned against me. What did we do wrong?" Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Emily did not call. Stephen did not apologize. Instead, I received another letter, this time from a lawyer representing them. They were demanding money for emotional damage and threatening to sue me. I held that paper in my hand and felt my soul burn. They wanted to destroy me, take everything I had worked for, leave me with nothing. But something inside me shifted that day. I had spent my whole life being patient, kind, forgiving, but patience has a limit. I looked into the mirror at my wrinkled face, my grey hair, my tired eyes. They think I am weak because I am old, I told myself, but they have forgotten who I really am. I am the man who built this life from nothing. I am the man who survived poverty, death of my wife, endless nights of labor. I will not go down without a fight. That was the night I decided I would not give Emily or Stephen a single dollar. If they wanted war, they would have it. I gathered my old journals, my business records, the proof of every sacrifice I had ever made for my family. I began writing my story, not just for me, but for the world to know the truth. If my daughter wanted to paint me as a villain, I would show the world who the real villain was. And deep inside I felt something I had not felt in years, a fire of revenge. The first hearing came faster than I expected. I wore my best grey suit, the same suit I had worn at Emily's wedding years ago, back when I still believed happiness was possible for her. The courthouse smelled of paper, sweat and fear. I walked slowly, my cane tapping against the floor, my heart heavy but my head held high. When I entered the courtroom, I saw them. Emily sat beside Stephen, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at me, not once. Stephen's lips curved in a half smile, the smile of a man who thought he had already won. The judge entered and the case began. Emily's lawyer stood first. He painted a picture of me as a violent, greedy old man who had attacked his daughter and son-in-law during breakfast. He even held up a shirt with a coffee stain, saying it was proof of the fight. When it was my turn, Peter stood for me. He spoke calmly, with the dignity of truth. "Your Honor," he said, "Richard Miller is 67 years old. He has no history of violence. He has spent his life building this city, raising his daughter after his wife passed away. The only crime he committed was refusing to pay his son-in-law's $400,000 debt." The courtroom murmured. People shifted in their seats. The judge looked at me. "Mr. Miller, do you have anything to say?" I stood, my hands trembling not with fear but with pain. "Your Honor," I said, "I am an old man. My body is weak, but my heart still remembers every sacrifice I made for my daughter. I worked until my hands bled to give her food, clothes, and education. And now, because I would not hand over my savings, she throws coffee at me and calls the police. That is the truth. I never laid a hand on her. My only crime is being a father who said no." For a moment, silence filled the room. Emily shifted uncomfortably. Stephen squeezed her hand, whispering something into her ear. The judge did not give a final decision that day. He set another hearing, saying more evidence was needed. But as I left the courthouse, I could feel the eyes of the people on me. Some looked with pity, others with doubt. A few whispered as I passed. The story was spreading. An old man accused by his own daughter. That night, I could not sleep. I walked through my empty house, each room echoing with memories. The kitchen where Margaret once cooked, the living room where Emily used to dance as a child, the bedroom where I had held my wife's hand as she slipped away from this world. Now those same memories felt poisoned. I sat at my desk and opened my old business ledgers. Page after page showed the money I had saved, the land I had bought, the small fortune I had built through sweat and pain. That was what Stephen wanted. That was why Emily had turned against me. I closed the books and looked out the window at the snowy street. "They think they can take everything from me," I whispered to myself. "But they will learn that even an old man has strength when he has nothing left to lose." From that night, I began to plan, not just to defend myself in court, but to show the world who Emily and Stephen really were. I spoke to neighbours, old business partners, anyone who had ever dealt with Stephen. Slowly, stories began to surface. Stories of loans never paid back, of promises broken, of lies told. He had cheated people before. I wasn't his first target. Every piece of information felt like a weapon in my hands. Not the kind of weapon that draws blood, but the kind that reveals truth. I knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in weeks, I felt alive again. Because revenge, I realized, is not always about anger. Sometimes it's about showing the world the face behind the mask. And I promised myself I would not rest until Emily and Stephen's masks were ripped away. I spent the next weeks collecting every shred of truth I could find. At my age, most men sit quietly in rocking chairs, reading newspapers, waiting for their last days. But I was not ready to sit quietly. My daughter and her husband had declared war, and I had no choice but to fight. I began by calling old friends from the construction world. Men I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were retired, some still worked small jobs. I asked each one the same question. "Have you ever crossed paths with a man named Stephen Ross?" And the stories came pouring in. One man told me how Stephen had borrowed money to start a business and disappeared without paying it back. Another said Stephen promised to invest in a property but ran away with the deposit. Someone else whispered that Stephen used to gamble. Big amounts, always losing, always begging for more. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Stephen was not just unlucky, he was a con man. But here was the cruelest part. Emily knew. She knew who he was and still stood by him. That truth cut deeper than any knife. I gathered documents, letters, bank slips, even witness statements. I placed them carefully in a folder, each page heavy with proof. When I looked at that folder, I felt strength in my hands again. The next court date came. I walked in, folder under my arm, cane tapping against the marble floor. Stephen sat smugly, his arm around Emily. She looked pale, as if she hadn't slept. The judge asked for evidence. Stephen's lawyer began with emotional words, painting me again as cruel, greedy, unloving. But when it was Peter's turn, he opened the folder and laid the truth bare. "Your Honor," Peter said firmly, "before you today is not a case of assault. It is a case of manipulation. My client is a victim of a financial trap. The man demanding $400,000 has a history: gambling, unpaid loans, fraud. These are documents, signed and verified. These are witness statements. This is the real Stephen Ross." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Stephen's face turned red. Emily's hands shook as she held onto his arm. The judge frowned, reading through the papers. He looked at Stephen. "Do you deny these records?" Stephen stammered, sweat on his forehead. They're lies, old lies. People are jealous." But I could see it in the judge's eyes. The doubt had taken root. When the session ended, no final judgment was given yet, but the tide had shifted. For the first time, the weight of lies was no longer on my shoulders. It was on theirs. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Someone had leaked the story. Microphones and cameras surrounded me. "Mr. Miller, is it true your daughter demanded money?" "Mr. Miller, do you plan to forgive her?" I didn't answer much. I just said, the truth always comes out, even if it takes time. That night, I sat by my window again, looking at the snow falling under the streetlight. My heart still ached. I had lost the daughter I once knew. But I also felt a strange peace. I wasn't weak. I wasn't broken. I was fighting back. And deep inside, I knew this battle wasn't just about me. It was about every parent who gave everything for their child, only to be betrayed in the end. The final hearing was coming, and I promised myself, when I stood there again, I would show no weakness. I would show them all who Richard Miller really was. Because revenge was no longer just a fire in my chest. It was the truth I carried in my hands. The last hearing came on a bright spring morning. The snow had melted, but the chill of betrayal was still inside me. I woke early, shaved carefully, and put on the same grey suit. I wanted to walk into that courtroom not as a broken father, but as a man who had lived with dignity and truth. When I arrived, Emily was already there. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale. Stephen sat beside her, his jaw tight, his hands restless. He was nervous. He had every reason to be. The courtroom filled quickly. Neighbours, reporters, strangers, everyone wanted to see how the story of a father betrayed by his daughter would end. The judge entered, and silence fell. The prosecutor repeated the accusations, but his voice sounded weaker this time, as if even he no longer believed them. Then it was Peter's turn. My old friend stood tall, his voice strong. "Your Honour," he said, "this case is not about assault. It is about greed. A father refused to pay his daughter's husband's enormous gambling debt. In anger, coffee was thrown, lies were told, and police were misused. But the truth has been uncovered. We have documents proving Stephen Ross's gambling, unpaid debts, and fraud. We have witnesses ready to testify. And most importantly, we have a man, Richard Miller, who has lived his life with honour, with sacrifice, with love for his family. He is not the criminal here. He is the victim." He handed the folder of evidence to the judge. The judge read quietly for several minutes. Each second felt like an hour. My hands gripped my cane tightly. Finally, the judge looked up. His voice was calm, steady. "After reviewing all evidence, I find no proof that Richard Miller assaulted his daughter or her husband. In fact, the evidence suggests manipulation and false accusations. Therefore, the charges against Mr. Miller are dismissed." Gasps filled the room. My chest loosened. For the first time in months, I felt I could breathe. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned to Emily and Stephen. "Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into Stephen Ross's financial dealings. If fraud is proven, appropriate charges will follow." Stephen's face turned white. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not the tears of a daughter ashamed, but the tears of someone who realized her lies had failed. The gavel struck. Court was dismissed. I stood slowly, my body weak but my heart burning with strength. People turned to me, some clapped, some whispered words of respect. Cameras flashed. But I didn't care for fame. I only cared that the truth had won. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked, "Mr. Miller, do you forgive your daughter?" I paused. I thought of the little girl with the red bicycle, the one who once called me her hero. Then I thought of the woman who threw coffee at me, who lied to the police, who tried to strip me of everything I had. I looked into the cameras and said, "Forgiveness is for those who are sorry. My daughter is not sorry. My story is not about forgiveness. It is about survival. Let this be a lesson. A parent's love is deep, but even love cannot be used as a weapon forever." That evening, I returned home. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. My wife's picture still stood on the shelf, and I felt her presence with me. I whispered, "Margaret, I did it. I stood tall. They tried to break me, but I am still standing." I sat in my chair, the fire burning in the fireplace, and I felt peace. Revenge, I realized, had never been about destroying them. It had been about protecting myself, my dignity, my truth. And in that courtroom, in front of the world, I had won. Emily and Stephen disappeared from my life after that. I never heard from them again. Some said they moved away. Others said Stephen was arrested later for fraud. I did not chase the story. It was no longer my burden. At 67, I had learned the harshest truth of life. Sometimes the children we raise grow into strangers. But I had also learned another truth. When you have nothing left but your dignity, that is enough to carry you through the darkest days. And so, I tell my story not for pity, but for strength. Because if an old man like me can survive betrayal from his own blood, then anyone can survive anything. When the trial ended, people expected me to celebrate. Neighbors stopped me on the street, shook my hand, told me how brave I had been. Reporters wrote about me, the old father who fought back. Strangers even sent me letters saying my story gave them strength. But when the doors of my house closed at night, the silence returned, the kind of silence that eats at your chest. I had won the case, yes. The world knew I was innocent, yes. But what had I truly gained? I had lost my daughter forever. I would sit in my living room at night, the fire crackling, my cane resting beside me. My wife's photograph stared at me from the shelf. Sometimes I would imagine her voice, soft and warm. "Richard, don't let the pain consume you." But pain has its own language. It whispers when you try to sleep. It walks beside you when you try to move forward. For weeks I struggled. I cooked small meals, ate alone, washed the dishes slowly. I walked to the park, watched children play, and wondered if they too would one day betray their parents. Every smiling face reminded me of the daughter I had lost. One evening, as I was returning from the park, an old neighbour, Mrs. Collins, stopped me. She was a widow too, kind eyes behind her glasses. She said, "Richard, you cannot spend the rest of your days alone with ghosts. Come join us at the community centre. We have a group for seniors. It will do you good." At first I refused. I didn't want to sit in a circle and talk about my life like some broken man. But she insisted, and one day I agreed. The community centre was small but warm. There were people my age, men and women with grey hair, wrinkled faces, tired eyes, and each of them carried a story of loss. Some had lost children, others had been abandoned, some had faced poverty after a lifetime of work. As I listened, I realized something. I was not alone. My pain was not unique. Betrayal, loneliness, grief, these were not my burdens alone. They were human burdens. Slowly, I began to share my story too. At first, my voice cracked. I told them about Emily, about Stephen, about the court, the lies, the coffee thrown at me. And when I finished, the room was silent. Then one man put his hand on mine and said, "You are stronger than you think, Richard." For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of healing. Weeks turned into months. I made friends at the centre. We played cards, shared meals, told stories of our younger days. I even started teaching some of them small lessons about construction, how to fix broken chairs or repair small things. My hands felt useful again. But inside me, one question still burned. Would Emily ever regret what she did? I never received an apology, not a letter, not a phone call. Sometimes, late at night, I would stare at the phone and wonder if she might call. But the phone stayed silent. That silence was my answer. So I learned to let go. Not because I wanted to, but because holding on was killing me. At 70, I began to write my life story in a notebook. I wrote about my childhood, my wife, my work, my betrayal. Not to publish, not to sell, but to leave behind the truth. If one day someone found it, they would know Richard Miller was a man who suffered but never bowed down. And as I wrote, I realized something else. Revenge had already happened. Not by my hands, but by the truth itself. Stephen was under investigation for fraud. People avoided him. His name became dirty. Emily's life, tied to his, became quiet, hidden, small. That was their punishment. My revenge was simply living on, with dignity, without them. Because the greatest revenge for betrayal is survival. And so, even at 67, even with grey hair and tired bones, I stood tall again, not as the father betrayed, but as the man who refused to be broken. Years moved slowly after the trial, like autumn leaves drifting across an empty street. I was free, I was respected, but I was also alone. Emily never came back, not once. She never called, never wrote, never knocked on my door. It was as if I had buried her with my wife. Sometimes I wondered if she even told people I was alive, or if she erased me like an old stain. But life doesn't stop for heartbreak. The clock keeps ticking. The days keep passing. I had to decide whether I would sit in my chair until death came, or whether I would walk out into the world again. I chose to walk. The community centre became my second home. Mrs. Collins, the widow who first invited me, became a close friend. We shared tea in the afternoons, talked about books, about the old days when life was simpler. Sometimes we laughed, sometimes we cried. She never judged me. She just listened, and that was enough. Other seniors became like family too. There was George, a retired postman who still remembered every street of the city. There was Helen, who once sang in church choirs and still had a soft, trembling voice. Together we created small moments of joy, card games, picnics, Sunday dinners. For the first time in years, I felt I belonged somewhere again. But nights were still hard. Nights carry ghosts. I would sit by the fireplace, staring at the shadows, remembering Margaret's touch, Emily's childhood laughter. I often asked myself, did I fail as a father? One evening, I told Mrs. Collins about this doubt. She looked at me and said, "Richard, you gave your daughter everything you could, but children grow and sometimes they choose their own darkness. That is not your failure, it is theirs." Her words stayed with me. For the first time, I stopped blaming myself. I started writing more seriously in my notebook. Every page was heavy with memories. Poverty, hard work, my wife's smile, my daughter's betrayal. I wrote in simple words, the way I spoke. I wanted my story to be clear, raw, honest. I wrote not only about the pain, but also about the lessons. That love without respect is slavery, that money reveals character, that even blood ties can break when greed enters. Some days, writing made me cry. Some days it made me feel lighter. But every page was like a brick, and slowly I was building a wall against my sorrow. By the time I turned 72, I had filled 3 notebooks. I placed them in a box under my bed. Not for Emily, not for Stephen. They would never see them. But for whoever might find them when I was gone. My truth would not die with me. As years passed, my health weakened. My legs grew slower, my hands shook more often. But my mind remained sharp, sharper even than before. Pain had polished it like a blade. People at the centre began to ask me to speak. They wanted me to share my story in front of groups to inspire others. At first I was shy, but when I stood in front of a room full of faces and told them how a father survived betrayal, I saw tears in their eyes. They clapped, they hugged me, they told me I gave them strength. And in those moments I realized something powerful. I had turned my suffering into light for others. Emily had tried to bury me with lies, but here I was, alive, speaking truth, giving courage. That was victory. That was my revenge. One afternoon, after a long talk at the centre, a young man came to me. He said, "Mr. Miller, my own father abandoned me. I always thought I was broken, but your story showed me I can still live with dignity. Thank you." His words made me feel young again, even with my grey hair and tired bones. At 75, I began to see life differently. It wasn't about what I had lost anymore. It was about what I had left to give. And as long as I could still speak, still write, still look at the sky and whisper thanks, I had something to give. I may have lost my daughter, but I found something bigger. I found myself. And in the end, that was enough. I am 77 now. My hands tremble more, and my steps are slow, but my mind still walks far. The doctors say my heart is weaker, that I should rest more. I know what that means. My time is near, but I am not afraid. I have lived through storms that would have broken younger men. I buried the woman I loved, I lost the child I raised, I carried shame on my shoulders. And yet, I am still here. Every morning I sit by the window and watch the sun rise. It paints the sky gold, the same way it did when I was a boy working on my father's farm. Life has always been a circle, beginnings hiding inside endings. Sometimes I wonder if Emily ever thinks of me. Maybe she tells her children I am dead, or maybe she never speaks my name at all. But that no longer burns me. Her silence cannot erase my truth. My life is written, my notebooks are full, my story has been spoken. Even if she never returns, I am no longer waiting. I have forgiven her, not for her sake, but for mine. Forgiveness is freedom. And at my age, freedom is the greatest gift. The community centre still welcomes me. George and Helen are gone now, buried in quiet graves, but Mrs. Collins still visits. She brings me soup, sometimes pie, and we talk about the old days. She says I should publish my notebooks. I smile and tell her maybe. But deep inside, I know the notebooks are enough as they are, silent witnesses waiting for someone someday to read. At night, when the world is still, I often talk to Margaret. I close my eyes and whisper, "I did my best, my love. I failed in some ways, but I never stopped loving. and in my heart I hear her voice, gentle as always. You were enough. That is how I will go, not broken, not bitter, but enough. If anyone ever reads these words after I am gone, I want them to remember this. Life will hurt you, people will betray you, even your own blood may turn against you, but you must never let their cruelty define you. Stand tall, even when your back is bent with age. Speak your truth, even if your voice trembles. Love, even when love is not returned. And when the end comes, face it with open eyes and steady hands, because dignity is the only wealth that death cannot steal. This is the last page of my story. I close it with peace in my heart. My journey is finished, but my words remain. Goodbye.